right, so this brings us to the 90s, and this is when the Office of Civil Rights gets involved. So I'm sure, as we've gone through all of the court cases and laws, I'm sure you're realizing that there are a lot of gaps. There's a lot of information that seems vague, and districts can sort of take it and go in many different directions. So that's why in the 90s, the idea of, okay, let's start enforcing some of these ideas and refine what we actually mean. So you can see here there are four main components that were addressed, and each one of those connects to a violation. So let me, what I'll do is I'll start with violations. So the first one has to do with who is providing the education for English learners? Who are these teachers? Um, so, if you look back at the Castaneda v. Pickard decision, you needed to have adequate personnel. What doesn't say like who the people are, what type of training they need. So in the 90s, the OCR policy says, okay, you need to have ESL teachers who have been adequately trained, and they need to be evaluated by someone that understands what's happening, essentially. Um, this policy does not say what adequate training looks like. Is it a certification? Is it a Saturday class? Is it someone that just happens to speak Spanish? It's not very specific. We will get more specific as we approach 2000, 2015. But right now, in the 90s, we just needed to have someone that was adequately trained. Okay, so number two, the programs needed to have clear exit criteria for when students could leave the ESL classroom. Like, when are they ready to be able to go out into the mainstream classroom and they no longer need this extra support? So the violation was, once you were labeled as an English learner, you were just sort of stuck in the ESL classroom forever. Um, and, there was no way of really getting out or no way of knowing when you were ready to go in the classroom. And here's the thing, we always are in the process of learning and acquiring more language. All of us learn new words. We learn new ways of communicating in English. So just because you're learning doesn't mean that you can't participate in the regular classroom. So the question is, when are you on the same level or at the same starting point as an English monolingual? So the Office of Civil Rights said, look, districts, you need to have exit criteria, and they need to be based on something, an objective standard, like a test or like a GPA or like something that is objective and not just, well, a teacher thinks that this should happen. So that's something that came out of the OCR enforcement policy. The third and fourth actually go together. So let me explain the violation, what was going on. Districts were saying that a child could only have one label or one category of services, meaning districts were saying you can't have the label of being a student receiving special education and a student receiving English as a second language. Or you can't have the label of being gifted and talented and being an English learner. Well, the Office of Civil Rights said that's ridiculous. Of course, people can have two different labels or two sets of needs. And so they're saying that children can have multiple categories of support. So number three highlights, yes, of course, students might need special education and they might also be English learners. And the fourth highlights, of course, they could be gifted and talented and receive English as a second language. So in the grand scheme of things, when we look at violations, there are quite a number of violations that the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement Policy of 1991 was seeking to address. All right, so that takes us to our first Pennsylvania state code. This did not happen until 2001. So I'm guessing this is probably around the time that you all were born, at least within your lifetime. This is the first time Pennsylvania had a policy in regards to English learners, but we've had English learners from the very, 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 very beginning. So what we're going to do Friday is we're going to unpack the PA-BEC. You are actually reading the most recent updated version of the PA-BEC, and that's what we'll address in class on Friday. So I'm not going to talk about that right now, but I just want you to see where that falls in terms of the timeline. You are also children of the No Child Left Behind policy in education. A couple things that No Child Left Behind did um, was sort of reconceptualize the terminology that we use for English learners. So we moved from bilingual in the title to limited English proficient or English acquisition. So that's where we get our LEP terminology from. That comes to us from No Child Left Behind. I'm going to pop through a couple of these slides here quickly and just highlight a couple of other key things that happened under No Child Left Behind, which is a federal policy. Prior to No Child Left Behind, we did not have standards that helped us assess English learners. We didn't even have an assessment. So what No Child Left Behind did was it provided national ELP standards, English Language Proficiency Standards, which we will talk about in this course a little later. But I just want you to understand this is where they came from. And as far as a timeline, we're talking about the early 2000s. So the federal government said to states, okay, states, you need to have standards for English learners. You also need to have assessment for English learners. So what happened was states went together in consortiums and worked together to develop standards. So Pennsylvania is part of WIDA, W-I-D-A, and there are 35 other states that joined this consortium. So the cool thing about it is we share standards and we have the same WIDA assessment. And that's something that goes across state lines for the 35 states that are a part of that consortium. And it's not often that states work together. Often states have their own individual assessments. So this is where the WIDA assessment comes from. So English learners take the state assessment that everybody else takes. They also take this WIDA assessment that looks at language. So they take 2 sets of high stakes tests every year. So that's more than what the average student takes. And we will actually look at test reports in this class coming up. So you'll get to see like what the reports look like, what information is given, all that good stuff. But I want you to realize that that came from No Child Left Behind. Okay. The other thing that happened in the early 2000s was a push for voter initiative policy. So you can see here there were 3 states where there were voter initiatives that were put out for the public to vote on that allowed the public to give their opinion on bilingual education in public schools. California, Arizona, and Massachusetts. And what happened was all 3 of those states, the initiatives actually were passed to dismantle bilingual education and mandate sheltered English immersion, so English only environments. So this happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, and what's happening now, most recently, is that people are overturning this ban on bilingual education. So California repealed the ban. Massachusetts repealed the ban just a few years ago. Arizona is the only state that still has the mandate of sheltered English immersion. So I think it's interesting for us when we look at the legacy and the process of thinking about how to educate English learners. Voter initiatives had a significant impact on English learners in these 3 states. And it'll be interesting to see how that will play out in terms of will there be future voter initiatives and what might happen with that. But I think it's an important part of our history to consider. And that leads us to ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that's the federal policy that we're under right now. Um, and the Every Student Succeeds Act has us reevaluate No Child Left Behind, and it seeks to fix some of the problems with that federal guidelines and changes some things for English learners. So here are some of the positives that are a result of ESSA. First, we changed terminology from limited English proficient to English learners. We removed this unrealistic expectation of 100% of students passing the PSSA. There were also some financial changes in terms of how schools are funded. And English learners are no longer required to take the PSSAs their first year here. We can give them some relief in terms of taking the test a little later. There's still concerns. The focus is still on high stakes testing. There are still concerns that 3 years is not enough time for students to develop their proficiency in English. And the focus is still on English only. We don't recognize bilingualism, and that is problematic as well. But this is where we're at. You can see the continuation of policy. On Friday, we're going to really dive deep into what Pennsylvania says for us. But I'd be curious for you to reflect on these last two discussion questions. What are some of those changes? What changes have been positive? What have been negative for English learners? And where do you see us going from here? What's the next step? What's the next court case? What's the next federal guidelines that would support English learners? On Friday, again, we'll jump into state guidelines for Pennsylvania, and we'll unpack that a little more in more detail. Thanks.